Welcome to State of the World with me, Sally Lockwood in Dubai. We're going to be talking Ukraine today because, of course, there's this deadline of Thursday, Thanksgiving, for Ukraine to respond to America's peace plan that it's presented to them, which is causing a lot of upset, a lot of controversy over the fact that it appears to favor Russia so much. It appears to cause a lot of concern when it comes to European security. And well, I have a lot of questions about it, and I can't quite believe some of the points in the plan. So we're going to be talking through all this today with Davis Richardson, who knows Ukraine very well. Hi, Davis.
Hi, Sally. Thanks for having me on.
You are a journalist by trade, but you now are the CEO and founder of a company called AUSP, which stands for American Ukrainian Strategic Partnership. And essentially, you link American innovation and investment with rebuilding Ukraine. And you're in and out of Ukraine all the time, and you know a lot about it, and you're advising at very senior levels in US government. I just want to get your take on this 28-point plan that's been presented by the US to Ukraine with this really aggressive deadline of Thursday to accept it or not. In short, is this a good plan or a bad plan? What's your take on it?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this is just an initial proposal. When we look at how President Trump operates, when he first took office, there were all of these very bold statements, to put it mildly, about Canada becoming a new state of the U.S. There were these statements on Greenland. So I believe this is a negotiating tactic to get both sides to the table. I don't view this as a negotiation between the United States and Ukraine. I think this is a negotiation that's underway between Ukraine and Russia, based on some of the points in the plan and the fact that, they do seem to adhere very closely to the initial demands which Putin had put forward. This is the Russian position, and really it's going to be over the next week or so that this gets ironed out. Regarding the hard deadline, I think it's also important to realize that Trump said, well, it's a moving deadline, and in negotiations, you start off with something that's so outrageous that shocks people, and then you actually get closer to what the real objective of it is.
So do you think this is a strategy? Is this a tactic here rather than America potentially working with Russia on a plan that suits Russia and essentially asking Ukraine just to swallow it?
I think it's important to read between the lines of this, which is Army Secretary Dan Driscoll was in Kyiv. So was Army Chief of Staff General Randy George to discuss lessons learned on the battlefield. Our team at AUSP actually briefed General George several weeks ago during AUSA, discussing the innovation that's underway with a lot of the Ukrainian defense manufacturers. So as part of the security guarantee, I believe that there's going to be more of an incorporation with the United States defense industrial base and a lot of the companies that have come up in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion.
Your team briefed the Chief of Staff for the US Army, Randy George, just a few weeks ago, and he's also been involved in these high-level discussions when it comes to this peace plan in Kyiv. Is that right?
Yes, we did. And we fully reiterated the point. And General George understands that this is not just Russia. There are Iranian Shahed drones, which Russia is using to massacre civilians. There are, as well as Chinese DJI operating systems. And then there's North Korean conscripts. So this is very much an axis. The Trump administration is aware of that. Under the Biden administration, as much as we're talking about the United States revoking intelligence sharing, really, and this even goes back to under the Biden administration, there wasn't a proper technology bridge that was established between the U.S. government and the Ukrainian government, or with the manufacturers, to facilitate lessons learned from the battlefield and actually preparing America for the next generation of, inevitable conflict. War Department Secretary Pete Hegseth, in remarks that he gave in the springtime, he talked about the U.S. Focus on the Indo-Pacific region and how China will be the defining threat of our time. If you want to prepare for that, you need to understand what's going on in Ukraine, because China certainly is, and a lot of those tactics are certainly going to be used in the next iteration of what this looks like.
So when you were briefing the Chief of Staff to the US Army, what did your briefing consist of? Was it purely about security, or was it about other stuff as well?
It was about the axis. I think that's been one of the communication failures of the Biden administration, which is showing why what's going on in Ukraine is important to both the American taxpayer, but also American strategic interests. I think, broadly speaking, there wasn't proper communication on that, even if, many senior officials were aware of that. So our team reiterated these points, and then these were prepared marks that General George later gave, so I'm not saying that this had any influence on that, of course, but he gave a speech on how the U.S. defense companies, the large primes, which everybody knows, how we have a serious problem in our defense industry because so much is spent on R&D and so much goes into costs, and is this effective for both the war fighter and also, strategic interests? What's the point of having a tank or a large piece of machinery that costs the taxpayer millions of dollars when this can just get obliterated by a $1,000 FPV drone? So in the remarks which he gave at AUSA, I was very optimistic that the U.S. military actually recognizes where a lot of these threats are going and how it needs to be prepared to address them.
And do you think America is being tough enough on Russia? When you look at this 28-point plan, what do you make of it? It's very favorable to Russia. It's suggesting complete amnesty, when it comes to the war crimes that have been committed, not to mention all the other things which we'll get into in a sec, but just on face value, what is America trying to do here?
I think America is playing the intermediary. Many of these are the points where Russia currently stands, and this is not the final product of the negotiations. And I think we're going to see
Okay.
what that looks like pretty quickly, but I don't interpret this as final. I echo some of the concerns which you echoed. Believe it or not, and regarding some of the points regarding an educational and cultural exchange between the two countries, I see a very hard time with that being implemented. In addition to the work that AUSP does with defense and investment and positioning ourselves for reconstruction, if that does happen, bear in mind you can't have reconstruction without defense, but we're also very involved with cultural preservation efforts and initiatives in Ukraine. And actually, believe it or not, a couple of our partners, a Gen Z Ukrainian artist collective, was hit by a second Russian drone strike 2 weeks ago as negotiations are going on. So that's the
Oh my God.
counterparty that you're negotiating. And this is the second time. This is not a military facility. This is not an energy site. This is a Gen Z artist collective. So the fact that you could have some kind of cultural exchange, going on when Russia wants to wipe out Ukraine's culture. In fact, even as these discussions have been going on, Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian propagandist, whatever you want to call it, who's been supporting what Russian President Putin has doing with the killing of Ukrainians. Alexander Dugin wrote on X that within a few years, Ukraine will be fully absorbed into Russia. And essentially, like that's the position of the Russian government. And, it's very troubling. And I view this framework, which has been put by the White House, as a starting point to negotiations to hopefully get to an okay place.
Just as you were saying there, the fact that your partners in Ukraine, who are like Gen Z artists, got hit by a drone for what, the second time? it just speaks to how dangerous Ukraine is now. And it's hard to explain unless you're there. I mean, I haven't been there for a while, but even on the occasions where I was there, you would have air raid sirens every night in almost any city. And for the Ukrainians that I speak to on a regular basis, the drone attacks have just got so much worse, and there's so many drones being flown into Ukraine every night that it really is terrorizing civilians, and it's completely indiscriminate. It's not like you say, it's not just energy infrastructure or military facilities that are being hit. It's anything. It's residential buildings, and it's been nearly 4 years that people have had to live like this. Some sort of ceasefire cannot come soon enough, and I've been saying that for so long now. But when you look at this plan, does it feel realistic to you? And what do you make of these accusations that it looks like it's been written in Russian and then translated into English?
I think it's important to look at how the Trump administration operates. The Russians are very, very tough negotiators. So again, I would just reiterate that it's a starting point and that very, very serious U.S. military people were dispatched to Kyiv that understand the situation and how all of these points with Russia, even with Venezuela, all of these are very closely interrelated. And to your point, I agree 100% with, that the Russian military is committing mass war crimes against Ukrainians, which are largely underreported. The sound of a ballistic missile, and Russia is also flying them a lot lower than they used to fly. They used to fly them. Hearing one of these, as I have, as our team has heard, going right above your head, I compare it to that horrible sound in Lord of the Rings with those black dragon things that would go over it's a really horrible sound that's meant to inflict terror on civilians. And, when we were there in the fall, this summer, you hear the explosions, even in Kyiv, which compared to a frontline community like Sumy or Kharkiv is, relatively safer. But even Kyiv is being hit quite hard. There was an American company in Lviv that was recently hit. So I think it's important to remember that's who you're negotiating with. And President Trump is right with peace through strength, and that's the only strategy and approach that U.S. adversaries like Russia really respond to. To your point on is the Trump administration doing enough, I think it's important. When the initial draft of the peace plan was released by the White House, U.S. sanctions against two of Russia's largest oil companies also went into effect. And I think this is also going to have a lot of consequences against Russia. So the Trump administration is actually, in my opinion, applying maximum pressure on both sides to bring both of them to the table. Regarding the sanctions, this is also going to hit, in particular, Serbia, because these companies have a very heavy footprint in the Balkans. So Serbia is going to be very heavily hit with it, which is going to push them hopefully closer to the European Union. That's one of the Russian government's strongest allies at this point. A couple of years ago, they were doing a pretty good job, but they've seemed to stray a little bit closer to Russia over the past 6 to 8 months. So that's where we're at right now. And I think President Trump is right. Peace through strength, maximum pressure, and let's find a suitable solution that can advance U.S. strategic interests and have a good outcome.
Now, let's just talk about a few of the points. We can't go through all 28 of them, but some of them are jaw-dropping, in my opinion. I can't quite believe what is being suggested. So let's talk about territory, Davis, to start with. So for people who aren't familiar with Ukraine, the east of Ukraine, which is known as the Donbass region, the majority of it at the moment is now under Russian control, but there is quite a significant part of it that is still under Ukrainian control, and they are suggesting that all of that would go to Russia. Is that right? Under this peace proposal, which would mean that areas of the country, territory that Russia currently doesn't control, they would control under this peace proposal. And, in light of what you were just saying about the war crimes committed by Russia, this is essentially rewarding them. It's giving them exactly what they want, plus more. They're not only the territory that they've already taken by invading Ukraine, they're also potentially going to be rewarded with territory that they don't even hold yet. I mean, that's shocking, isn't it? What do you make of that?
I obviously don't love it, and Ukrainians certainly, this is not going to fly with them. I think it's important to remember that Zelensky is in a very tough position right now. There was the recent Energoatom scandal, which hit his administration pretty hard, but ultimately, any any proposal that is signed, it's not just up to Zelensky or the United States, really, for that matter. This is going to be up to the Ukrainian people, and if the Ukrainian people feel that this does not preserve their territorial integrity, that the proper security guarantees are not put in place, as the past few years have shown us, Ukrainians are very, very tough, right? And they've held President Zelensky's feet to the fire throughout these past few years. So if something doesn't fly with them, they are going to let the world know. And I believe that President Zelensky will do right by the Ukrainian people, because what was all of this for at the end of the day?
Do you see these areas of Donetsk and Luhansk being handed over to Russia? I don't know how far east you've been in Ukraine, Davis, but the likes of Dnipro, which is right on the border of the Donbass and very far east. Potentially, people who live there could end up being very threatened by Russian control. Is that correct? This is a city which is still, under Ukrainian control at the moment and still has a fairly liberal way of life. And, I've stayed there, you see the hipsters opening their cafes in the morning, trying to, make their coffees and keep going in light of the fact that they've got war happening on their doorstep. I mean, what would happen to people who live there? Would they find themselves potentially under Russian control by the stroke of a pen?
Well, I think we need to wait for the final version of this. I echo the concerns which you're bringing up here. One of the points that was in there was Dnipro River will actually be a trade corridor for Ukraine. There were actually a couple of other things in the plan which I didn't think were the worst. For instance, the $100 billion in frozen Russian assets being unlocked to jumpstart U.S.-led reconstruction. I think, when you look at countries like Belgium, which have just been holding on to these frozen Russian assets rather than unlocking them to fund Ukraine's defense, it's kind of mind-blowing. I'll add to that a lot of European countries, although they're participating in a lot of really good photo ops with President Zelensky and saying that they support Ukraine and showing up at the right speaking panels, they continue to buy Russian oil and Russian gas, whereas the Trump administration just enacted a very, very serious round of sanctions against them. So I think it's important to look at all of this pretty holistically. What is happening behind the scenes? Where are the other activities which point to maximum pressure being leveraged, as opposed to just something that's being stated? Again, I think this is a starting point to negotiations, and we don't want to end up in a situation like we had with the Budapest memorandum or the Minsk agreement.
Davis, just on that, on these frozen Russian assets that would go towards these new investment opportunities and ventures between America and Ukraine. From the European perspective, they were in the process of unfreezing $140 billion worth of frozen Russian assets, if I'm not mistaken, around that, in order to offer it to Ukraine as reparations to help with the rebuilding of Ukraine. Under the American proposal, it would be $100 billion unfrozen to go into this joint Ukrainian-American venture, of which America would get 50% of the profit without putting in a dime. How's that fair?
Well, I think America has put in, several hundred billion dollars, and I will agree there is a discrepancy between the amount pledged and actually how that gets dispersed out. But America has been the largest fiscal backer of this, and when you look at, the Trump administration's worldview and using sovereign pathways as well as political risk insurance vehicles like DFC, it emphasizes an approach to private sector led development. I think one of the biggest issues that we saw with the Biden administration is that it was largely speaking a blank check in a lot of ways, and U.S. aid was not effective in the ways that it needed to be. When our team was in Ukraine this was springtime of last year, we met with some U.S. Embassy personnel, and what they were most excited about, or what they were telling us that they were doing, was a translation of Tony Kushner's Angels in America from English to Ukrainian. That is kind of mind blowing. And by the way, I loved Al Pacino's performance of Roy Cohn in the film adaptation. But there's no reason why U.S. taxpayer dollars should have been allocated to that. And really, who are the most hurt by bad policy like this? It's the Ukrainians in frontline communities who you're purporting to help. So I think in a lot of ways, the pivot that we're seeing right now to the private sector is much welcome. And to the point on Europe was in the process of unfreezing them. They've been in this process for several years right now. They haven't done it. They continue to buy Russian oil and gas and really fund two sides of this and the Russian war economy. So I'm all for unfreezing the asset, letting U.S. companies have a say in what reconstruction looks like, and abiding by best governance standards. The Maidan Revolution and all of this partially was about being able to select into a free market and economic system where you can self-select into communities rather than worry about offending the wrong oligarch, as is the case in Russian society, and then having your opportunities in life limited. So best governance standards and economic trade with the U.S. and solid security guarantees. That's what we believe in.
Just on that, on this, on these investment plans between America and Ukraine, I should say that they were under the current proposal. It's $100 billion worth of frozen assets, but they would also be expecting Europe to put in another $100 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in a joint venture where the US would get 50% of the profit. And if I'm not mistaken, the rest would go to a US-Russia investment venture. Is that correct?
I haven't looked at anything related to a U.S.-Russia investment venture. I know that is a part of the discussions. I did not see it allocated in the plan. That being said, our opinion at AUSP is that having solid economic ties between the United States and Russia is structurally impossible. This is a country that does not share our values, like Ukraine, and which has committed mass war crimes against a wonderful ally, and needs to be punished hard for that. To your point on some of the points in the plan, I think there need to be firmer consequences from against Russia on that front, and that we can't just walk away with all being forgiven from this. I think the media has presented, and as someone who continues to work in the news business, even with AUSP, the media has presented a very sanitized version of what's going on with this. And there are so many stories in Ukraine that are ordinary to them, but are unspeakable tragedy. These are very, very serious, deep, emotional wounds. We've held the hands of mothers who have lost loved ones on the front lines, and it's very, very tragic. I think peace through strength and wanting to bring a conclusion to this with proper security guarantees and deterrence against Russia is ultimately a noble solution to this, and we're going to see what the final proposal of it looks like.
Yeah, just on that, Davis, I couldn't agree with you more. When I saw in the 28-point plan that one of the points was complete amnesty for both sides in terms of anything that's happened in the nearly 4 years of all out war in Ukraine. You know, I too have met people who've lost their loved ones. I've met women who've been raped. I've met, you'll remember the atrocities that were carried out in Bucha on the outskirts of Kyiv. I interviewed the mayor there. He told me that the majority of people that were killed in Kyiv, that were killed in Bucha, were killed with a single gunshot wound. You know, they were executed. And I think the fact that there would be no legal recourse for Russia would be not only devastating when it comes to human rights and for Ukraine, but it would be a very worrying precedent set.
I would certainly echo those points which you're saying, and we'll see what the final proposal of this looks like.
A final thought from you, Davis. There's only a few days till this deadline. What do you see happening, and how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think it will likely get extended, and I think we're going to see the real Ukrainian perspective start to come up. I think the long term, what's really being negotiated on the U.S. and the Ukrainian side is you've had this entire industry that has come up in Ukraine since 2022, which is Ukraine had a bit of a defense industrial debase after Maidan. It had to because of what was going on in the Donbass region. But really since 2022, this has exploded. You have a lot of defense manufacturers and UAS, electronic warfare, AI, that are developing really, really innovative solutions to what's going on the front lines. The United States needs to learn from lessons learned on the battlefield from what the new iteration of warfare looks like, and it can't be caught up in the past with lengthy procurement cycles and stuff that's designed in R&D facilities but is not frontline tested. I think really what this is about is a strengthening of the U.S. and Ukrainian defense industrial base and allowing both of these countries' strengths to really complement one another. I think some of the frictions and some of the emotional reactions that we've been seeing in the press is that when you look at Americans, and by the way, this existed under the Biden administration and most U.S. administrations, frankly speaking, which is United States has a very difficult time understanding other cultures. Even though we have some of the most cultures globally, and a lot of people want to come to the United States, and that's a big strength as we get the best of a lot of countries that come here. But foreign policy wise, when we went into Iraq, when we went into Afghanistan, we didn't understand these cultures the way that we should. I think what's incredible about Ukraine is, as opposed to those past foreign interventions, Ukrainians really share our values, and they want to become part of the global economy and a free market system that's based on meritocracy, which the United States still offers and is still the leader in the world with, and creates tremendous opportunity and wealth for its citizens, even despite a lot of the challenges that we're seeing economically with inflation that skyrocketed under the Biden administration. So we're very optimistic that both of these countries complement each other well. And I controversially say sometimes that Ukrainians have more in common with Americans than their European counterparts. Both sides don't really know it yet. Both are Christian, born in Christian societies with traditional family values, and both countries were born through revolution. And both understand all too well that freedom oftentimes requires sacrifice. So I like to look at what unites the United States and Ukraine, and these are not values which are shared with the Russian government, which continues to mass murder civilians in Ukraine.
Okay, Davis, I'd love to have you back on to talk about this again once we know exactly what the final draft looks like. But certainly from the Ukrainians that I'm in touch with, there's not a huge amount of trust when it comes to the current American administration. Let's see what happens. Stay in touch and definitely come back on again and we'll see where we're at post Thanksgiving.
Thanks so much, Sally. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. See you soon. And thank you to you guys for watching. If you've enjoyed the episode, please hit like, hit subscribe. It's completely free, makes a big difference to how the channel grows, and we'll see you again soon.